Forget the caricature of the horned, helmeted barbarian, a brutish figure of pure destruction. That image, born from the terror of their victims and the fantasies of later centuries, is a shadow of the truth. This is the story of what it was really like to be a Viking. We will journey beyond the battlefield to discover a people far more complex and compelling than the legends suggest. We will step into the smoky, fire-lit world of the Norse longhouse, a home built of timber and turf, where families huddled together against the biting winds that swept down from the north. Here, life was governed not by the thirst for plunder, but by the rhythm of the seasons, the struggle to sow and harvest crops in a short, precious summer, and the need to endure the crushing, isolating darkness of a long winter. We will stand among the free people at the Thing, their open-air assembly, where laws were made, justice was debated, and a person's honor was their most valuable possession. We will sail aboard their magnificent longships, marvels of design that were not merely tools of war, but vessels of discovery and trade that carried them to bustling new markets and entirely new worlds. This is the authentic story of the Norse people, the farmer, the lawmaker, the explorer, the poet, and the trader. As our story travels across seas and through time, it makes me curious to know where it's finding you. Please, take a moment to write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always incredible to see how these stories connect us all. And if you enjoy this journey into the past, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you will be notified when our future stories are released. Now, let us begin. Our story starts not on the battlefield, but on the land, where the true heart of the Viking world is found. The heart of the Viking world was not the sea, but the soil. For the vast majority of the Norse people, life was an unending cycle of labor tied to the land, a relentless effort to wring survival from the unforgiving earth of the north. Their world was the fjords, the long, winding inlet of the sea that snaked its way inland, and the homestead, the byre, that clung to a patch of fertile ground along its shore. Imagine a farmstead, nestled on a gentle slope to allow the cold air to drain away, its fields cleared from the dense forest that still crowded in on all sides. At its center, dominating the cluster of smaller outbuildings for storage and crafts, stood the longhouse. It was not merely a building. It was the entire world in miniature, the vessel in which the family navigated the treacherous seasons. From the outside, it resembled a great, overturned ship. Its long spine, the ridgepole, curving gracefully over a length that could stretch for 30 meters, nearly 100 feet, or even more for a powerful chieftain. The walls were constructed of sturdy timber posts, with the gaps between filled with wattle and daub. A lattice of woven branches plastered with clay and dung, or built from thick blocks of peat-like turf, which provided excellent insulation against the brutal cold. The roof, too, was often of turf, laid over a layer of birch bark, and soon sprouted a thick carpet of grass, making the house seem to grow directly from the earth itself. There were no windows, only a few small, shuttered openings to preserve heat, and a smoke hole in the roof directly above the central hearths. To approach the longhouse was to approach its soul through a single, heavy, wooden door. Stepping inside was to be plunged into a world of perpetual twilight and smoke. The air was thick and acrid. A permanent haze from the long, open fire pits that ran down the center of the earthen floor. This was the building's heart and lungs. There was no chimney. The smoke simply drifted upwards, coating the rafters in a black, greasy soot before finding its way out through the hole in the roof. This smoke was a constant companion, stinging the eyes and rasping the throat. But it was also a preservative, curing the meats that hung from the ceiling and keeping the timbers free from rot. The fire was the source of all warmth and all light, its flickering flames pushing back the oppressive darkness and casting long, dancing shadows on the faces of the people gathered around it. Down the length of the hall, on either side of the fire, were raised earthen or wooden benches that served as seating during the day and beds at night, covered in furs and hides. This is where the family, which often included parents, children, grandparents, and other relatives, ate, worked, and slept in close quarters. The chieftain and his wife would have a private, partitioned-off bed, but for most, privacy was a concept that did not exist. The livestock, the family's most precious asset, were often brought inside during the harshest parts of winter, their body heat adding to the warmth of the hall, their smells and sounds mingling with those of the humans. Life in the longhouse was a communal, noisy, and pungent affair, a constant hum of activity from dawn until the fire was banked for the night. This life was dictated by a rhythm so powerful it was ingrained in their bones, the turning of the seasons. Winter was the great enemy, a time of darkness and survival. For months, the sun would be a pale, fleeting visitor, barely climbing above the horizon. Temperatures would plummet to minus 20 degrees Celsius or minus 4 Fahrenheit and stay there for weeks. The world outside became a frozen, silent landscape buried under a heavy blanket of snow that could reach a meter deep, over 3 feet. The family was confined to the longhouse, their survival dependent entirely on the food they had managed to store. Days were spent on indoor tasks. For the men, it was a time to repair tools, to sharpen the blades of axes and plows, and to mend the fishing nets that would be essential come spring. For the women, it was an endless task of textile production. They would take the raw, greasy wool shorn from their sheep, card it to align the fibers, and then, using a drop spindle weighted with a stone or clay whorl, spin it into yarn. This yarn was then painstakingly woven into cloth on a large, upright, warp-weighted loom, a fixture in every home. Creating enough fabric for a single tunic was a monumental undertaking, the work of an entire winter. In the flickering firelight, the old ones would tell stories, the great sagas of gods, giants, and heroes, passing down their history and culture through the spoken word, shaping the minds of the young who listened intently. But beneath it all was a constant, gnawing anxiety. If the stores ran low, starvation was not a distant threat, but a very real possibility. When spring finally broke, it was a release, a frantic explosion of activity. The ice on the fjord would crack and groan, the snow would recede, and the earth would thaw, releasing the smells of damp soil and new life. This was no time for leisure. Every able-bodied person had work to do. The fields had to be prepared immediately to take advantage of the short growing season. The primary tool was the ard, a simple scratch plow, often pulled by a pair of oxen or even by the men themselves. It did not turn the soil like a modern plow, but simply carved a shallow furrow for the seeds. Into these furrows went barley, rye, and oats, hardy grains that could withstand the northern climate, along with vegetables like peas, beans, and cabbage grown in smaller plots closer to the house. The work was back-breaking, from dawn till dusk, a desperate race against time. Summer brought the long days, a near-endless stretch of light where the sun barely dipped below the horizon at night. This was the time for tending, for weeding the precious crops and protecting them from birds. It was also the season of the satyr, the high summer pastures. The livestock, cattle, sheep, and goats would be driven many kilometers, sometimes a dozen miles, up into the hills or mountains to graze, fattening themselves on the rich grass. Often the women and older children would go with them, living in small, simple huts for weeks at a time, milking the animals and making butter and skyr, a thick, tangy, yogurt-like cheese that was a vital source of protein. Meanwhile, back at the farm, the men would be focused on another critical task: making hay. Every meadow had to be cut with scythes, the grass raked and left to dry in the sun, then gathered and stored securely for the winter. A farm's wealth could be measured by the size of its hayrick. It was the fuel that would keep the animals, and therefore the people, alive through the coming darkness. Then came autumn, the season of reckoning. The harvest was a period of intense, communal labor that determined who would live and who would die in the months ahead. The grain was cut with iron sickles, bundled into sheaves, and brought back to the farm to be threshed, beaten with flails to separate the grain from the stalks. This precious harvest was then stored in dry, safe outbuildings, guarded against damp and rodents. At the same time, any animals that could not be fed over the winter were slaughtered. Nothing was wasted. The meat was preserved by smoking, salting, or drying in the wind. The blood was used to make sausages. The bones were boiled for broth or carved into tools like needles and combs. The hides were tanned to make clothing, shoes, and ropes. It was a time of grim necessity and solemn preparation, the final act of defiance against the encroaching winter. This constant, grinding labor, this intimate connection to the earth and its cycles, was the foundation of their world. It shaped their bodies, their beliefs, and their society. It was the life they fought to protect, and the economic reality that, for some, would eventually push them to look outward, beyond the shores of their fjords, toward the sea. Life on the homestead, governed by the unyielding demands of the seasons, was the bedrock of Norse existence. But it was not a life lived in isolation. Each farm, each family, was a single thread in a much larger and intricately woven social fabric. This society was far from the lawless anarchy imagined by its victims. It was a world bound by a complex web of laws, a rigid social hierarchy, and an all-consuming code of personal honor that dictated every interaction, from the simplest greeting to the most profound matters of life and death. The ultimate expression of this order was the Thing, the open-air assembly that was the beating heart of their community. Several times a year, at a sacred and traditional site, perhaps a prominent hillside, a large field marked by standing stones, or beneath the branches of a venerated old tree, all the free people of the region would gather. They came from homesteads scattered many kilometers apart, some traveling for days, a journey of perhaps 30 kilometers or nearly 20 miles by foot or by boat along the fjord. They came armed. The axe at a man's belt or the spear in his hand was not necessarily a threat of violence. but a potent symbol of his status. To be armed was to be free, to be a carl, a man with a voice and a stake in the community. To be unarmed was to be a thrall, a slave, who had no place or say in these proceedings. The thing was a combination of parliament, court, and community festival. Here, under the open sky, new laws were proclaimed, disputes were settled, marriages were announced, inheritances were confirmed, and political alliances were forged. It was a noisy, vibrant affair, a temporary town springing up where people traded goods, shared news, and arranged alliances. At the center of the proceedings stood the lagsogumader, the law speaker. This was a position of immense prestige, held by a man elected for his wisdom, and, most importantly, his memory. For the law was not written down in leather-bound books. It lived in the minds of the people and was entrusted to the memory of the law speaker. His duty was to recite the law for all to hear, ensuring that this sacred knowledge was not lost or corrupted. At the great Althing in Iceland, the annual assembly of the entire nation, the law speaker would recite 1/3 of the legal code from a rocky outcrop known as the Law Rock each year, completing the entire code over his 3-year term. When the assembly heard a point of law they agreed with, they would not applaud. They would clash their weapons against their shields, the loud, percussive clang of metal on wood and leather rolling across the valley, a resounding affirmation of their collective will. When a dispute arose, a stolen cow, a contested property line, an accusation of insult or injury, it was brought before the thing to be resolved. Justice was a public performance. The accuser would state his case, and the accused would state his defense. Both would then swear powerful, binding oaths on a sacred ring, often consecrated to a god like Ullr. Their credibility was bolstered by oath helpers, kinsmen, and neighbors who would step forward to swear not to the facts of the case, but to the good character and truthfulness of the man they supported. This was a society where one's reputation was everything. The verdict was decided not by a single judge, but by a panel of chieftains or respected landowners. The goal was less about abstract justice and more about restoring balance and preventing the devastating cycle of blood feuds. For most offenses, the punishment was a fine, a system of compensation known as wergild, or man price. Every person and every body part had a value based on their social standing. The fine for killing a respected landowner was vastly greater than for killing a landless laborer. This system, while seeming unequal, provided a tangible way to settle grievances without resorting to endless, retaliatory killings, offering silver as a substitute for blood. but for the most heinous crimes, oath-breaking, murder within a family, or acts that brought profound dishonor, the assembly could deliver the ultimate punishment: outlawry. To be declared an outlaw, a skogarmaður, or forest man, was to be pronounced socially dead. The condemned lost all property, all rights, all protection under the law. He was to be driven from his home into the wilderness, and any person was not only permitted, but encouraged to kill him on sight, with no fear of penalty. It was a fate worse than a quick execution, a slow death of exile and exclusion from the very community that gave a person their identity. This legal system was built upon a foundation of a sharply defined, three-tiered social structure, a hierarchy believed to have been set by the gods themselves. At the very bottom were the thralls, the slaves. They were the engines of the Viking economy, the unpaid labor upon which the prosperity of every farmstead depended. A person could become a thrall in several ways: captured in a raid on a foreign shore, born to a thrall mother, or even a free person, forced to sell themselves into slavery to pay off a debt. A thrall was not a person, but property, an object to be bought and sold at market like livestock. They possessed no rights, could not bear arms, and had no voice at the thing. Their lives were an endless litany of the most grueling work: clearing forests, digging ditches, mucking out animal stalls, and serving the household in every capacity. They could be beaten, abused, or killed by their master with complete impunity. Their existence was a constant, stark reminder to the free of the preciousness of their own status. Above the thralls stood the carls, the free people who formed the backbone of Norse society. This was the great middle class of farmers, shipbuilders, merchants, blacksmiths, and warriors. The farmer we met in his longhouse was a carl. His freedom was his most prized possession, defined by his right to own land, to speak his mind at the assembly, to bear arms, and to expect compensation if he or his family were wronged. These were the men who filled the ranks of raiding parties and armies, who built the ships, and whose collective will shaped the law of the land. They were fiercely independent, proud of their lineage and their homestead, and they looked down upon the thralls below them, and often viewed the powerful chieftains above them with a mixture of respect and suspicion. At the apex of society were the jarls, the chieftains, and the aristocracy. A jarl was not a king who ruled by divine right. His power was far more personal and precarious. It was built on wealth, measured in land, silver, and the number of thralls he owned, and crucially, on his ability to attract and maintain a loyal following of warriors, known as his herd. To do this, a jarl had to cultivate a reputation for success and, above all, generosity. In his great hall, a larger and more lavish version of the common longhouse, he would host magnificent feasts, distributing food, ale, and most importantly, gifts. Rings of silver and gold, fine weapons, and exotic goods brought back from distant lands were handed out to his followers to secure their loyalty. A chief who was stingy or who led his men on unsuccessful raids would soon find his hall empty as his warriors drifted away to pledge their axes to a more promising leader. Power was a performance, constantly renewed through charisma, martial prowess, and open-handed gift-giving. Underpinning this entire structure of law and class was the invisible but all-powerful force of honor, or hyder. Honor was not a private matter of conscience. It was a person's public reputation, the sum of their deeds, and the respect they commanded from their peers. It was a man's most valuable possession, more precious than silver or land. Honor was gained through courage, by keeping one's word, by being a generous host, and by fiercely defending the reputation of oneself and one's family. To suffer an insult, no matter how small, a mocking verse, a shove in a crowded hall, and not respond, was to lose honor, to become a lesser man in the eyes of the community. This is why slights could so quickly escalate into deadly violence. A lawsuit at the thing was often less about the material compensation and more about the public reaffirmation of one's honor. This demanding code created a society of people acutely sensitive to their social standing, fiercely protective of their rights, and bound to their kin by obligations of mutual defense. It was this intricate, honor-bound society of laws and hierarchies that gave the Norse people the stability and structure they needed to thrive in a harsh land and, ultimately, to project their power across the sea. The physical world of the Norse people, a realm of hard soil, cold water, and unforgiving seasons, was only half of their reality. Interwoven with every rock, tree, and gust of wind was a second, invisible world, a cosmos teeming with unseen forces, powerful gods, and monstrous giants. This was not a faith kept separate for a specific day of the week. It was the very air they breathed, a constant, low-level hum of the supernatural that shaped their understanding of life, death, and their place in the universe. Their world was not a lonely globe spinning in a void, but one of 9 worlds, all held within the colossal, life-giving branches and roots of a great ash tree called Yggdrasil. This cosmic tree was the axis of all existence, its boughs brushing the heavens and its three great roots delving deep into the primordial realms. At its base coiled a monstrous serpent, Nidhugger, who perpetually gnawed on its roots, a constant threat of decay and collapse. At its very top perched an eagle, with a hawk sitting between its eyes, observing all that transpired. A squirrel named Ratatosker scurried ceaselessly up and down the trunk, carrying insults between the eagle and the serpent, a messenger of the discord that was an inherent part of creation. Mankind lived in a world called Midgard, the Middle Yard, a realm they understood to be a circular landmass surrounded by a vast, impassable ocean. In the depths of this ocean lurked the world serpent, Jormungandr, a creature so immense that it encircled the entire world, biting its own tail. Midgard was precious, but perilous, perpetually balanced between the divine order of Asgard, the celestial fortress of the gods above, and the raw, destructive chaos of Jotunheim, the land of the giants. It was the gods of Asgard who were the protectors of humanity, and it was to them that the people turned for favor and understanding. Chief among them, yet the most complex and inscrutable, was Odin. He was the All-Father, the god of wisdom, poetry, and magic, but also the god of war frenzy and the gallows. He was a wanderer, often traveling through Midgard in disguise as a gray, bearded man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to hide his most famous feature. He had only one eye. He had sacrificed the other to drink from the well of Mimir, trading half his sight for an immeasurable wisdom. Perched on his shoulders were his two ravens, Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, who flew across the 9 worlds each day to bring him news of all that happened. Odin was the patron of chieftains, kings, and poets, those whose lives were shaped by strategy, inspiration, and the pursuit of knowledge. He was not a god of comfort, but of sacrifice and relentless, often ruthless, ambition. If Odin was the god of the Jarl, then Thor was the god of the Carl. He was the son of Odin, but he could not have been more different. Thor was the champion of mankind, the thunderous protector of Midgard. He was straightforward, immensely strong, quick to anger, and possessed of a prodigious appetite for food and ale. He rode across the sky in a chariot pulled by 2 goats, and the rumbling of its wheels was the thunder they heard in the heavens. His weapon was the hammer Mjolnir, a symbol of order that he used to smash the heads of the chaos-bringing giants. When a storm gathered over the fjord, its dark clouds boiling and lightning splitting the sky, a farmer would see not a meteorological event, but a tangible glimpse of Thor's eternal battle against the enemies of creation. People wore small amulets of Mjolnir around their necks, a powerful symbol of protection against the dark and unpredictable forces of the world. Thor represented a strength that people could understand and rely on, a divine bulwark against the destructive powers that constantly threatened their fragile existence. Yet for the farmer, whose life was a daily struggle with the soil, perhaps the most important deities were not the Aesir gods of Asgard, like Odin and Thor, but the Vanir, a second family of gods associated with the earth itself. The most prominent were the twins, Freyr and Freyja. Freyr was the god of sunshine, good weather, and the harvest. His favor meant the difference between a full storehouse and a winter of starvation. Freyja, his sister, was the goddess of love, fertility, and abundance. People prayed to her for healthy children, for the multiplication of their livestock, and for the bounty of the fields. While Odin presided over the glorious death of the warrior, it was Freya who presided over the beginnings of life. It was to them that a farmer would likely make his most frequent offerings, a measure of grain, or the first fruits of his garden, left at a sacred stone or in a revered grove of trees. Underlying the actions of both gods and mortals was the inescapable concept of wired, or fate. The Norse did not believe in free will as we might understand it today. They believed that the destiny of every being, from the humblest thrall to Odin himself, was predetermined. At the base of Yggdrasil, by the well of Urd, sat the three Norns, mysterious female figures named Past, Present, and Future. It was they who spun the threads of life for all beings, weaving a vast and intricate tapestry of destiny. The length of a person's thread dictated the length of their life, and the patterns woven into it determined their fortune. This belief did not lead to passivity. On the contrary, it fostered a powerful sense of purpose. Since one's fate was already sealed, the true measure of a person was how they faced it. The greatest virtue was to meet one's destiny, whether glorious or tragic, with unflinching courage and defiance. Religious practice was not conducted in grand temples, but was woven into the landscape and the home. The central ritual of their faith was the blot, a sacrifice made to honor the gods and win their favor. These were held at key times of the year, at the start of winter, to ensure survival. In midwinter, to mark the turning of the darkest season, and at the start of summer, to ask for success in raiding, trading, and farming. A great chieftain would host a large blot in his hall. An animal, often a horse or a boar, would be sacrificed. Its blood was collected in a bowl, and using a ritual twig, sprinkled over the altar, over the carved wooden idols of the gods, and over the people themselves, forging a sacred connection. The meat of the animal was then cooked in great cauldrons over the central fire and consumed in a communal feast. This was a sharing of a meal, not just among the people, but with the gods, strengthening the bonds of the community and reinforcing the power of the chieftain who provided for his followers, both materially and spiritually. When a life's thread was finally cut by the Norns, the Norse took profound care in preparing the dead for their journey to the next life. They believed in several possible destinations. The most famous was Valhalla, Odin's Hall of the Slain, a majestic hall in Asgard where the spirits of elite warriors who died bravely in battle would feast and fight until they were called upon to serve Odin in the final battle of Ragnarok. But Valhalla was not the only destination for the honored dead. Freyja also chose half of the slain to live with her in her hall, Folkvanger, for the vast majority of people who died of old age or sickness, a straw death, as they called it. The path led to the cold, misty realm of Hell, ruled over by a goddess of the same name. This was not a place of punishment like the Christian hell, but a shadowy, dreary continuation of existence. Because they believed the afterlife was a tangible place, they buried their dead with everything they would need. A farmer might be buried with his favorite axe and knife, a woman with her bronze brooches, beads, and weaving tools. For the wealthy and powerful, the send-off was a spectacular display. The dead chieftain might be laid to rest in a burial chamber lined with timber and covered by a great earthen mound, a barrow that would become a permanent landmark, visible for kilometers, for miles around. The most magnificent of all was the ship burial. Here, the deceased was laid upon a real sea-going vessel, a longship up to 20 meters or over 65 feet in length. He would be dressed in his finest clothes, surrounded by his weapons, his drinking horns, his cauldrons and tools, his horses, his dogs, and sometimes even a sacrificed thrall would be laid beside him to serve him in the next world. The ship, the ultimate symbol of power, wealth, and mobility in this life, would then become the vessel for his final journey into the mists of the afterlife, before the entire scene was buried beneath tons of earth and stone, a final, monumental testament to a life lived and a belief in a world that lay just beyond the veil of death. For generations, the sea had been a boundary and a larder. It was the great gray wall at the edge of their world, a source of herring and cod, a highway connecting the scattered farmsteads along the winding coast. but it was also a monster. Its icy waters and ferocious storms a constant threat to any who dared venture too far from the safety of the fjord. Then, something changed. A new sound began to echo from the beaches and inlets, not the familiar rhythm of waves on stone, but the percussive ring of the shipwright's axe on oak. In a revolution of wood and iron, the Norse people perfected a vessel that would not just conquer the sea, but transform it into a weapon. They created the Longship, and in doing so, they unleashed themselves upon the world. The Longship was not merely a boat, it was the masterpiece of a culture, a sublime fusion of form and function, a creature of both terrifying beauty and brutal efficiency. To see a longship being born was to witness a kind of magic. The process began with a magnificent oak tree, its trunk straight and tall, which was felled and then split with wedges and mallets, never sawn. Sawing tears through the wood's natural fibers, weakening it, but splitting followed the grain, preserving its inherent strength and flexibility. From these split timbers, the shipwrights would hew the long, curving planks, each one shaped by the skill of the eye and the bite of the axe. The ship's backbone was the keel, a single, massive timber that could be over 15 meters long or about 50 feet, carved from the heart of the mightiest oak. To this, the stem and stern posts were attached, curving gracefully upwards like the neck of a swan. Then came the shell of the ship, built using a technique known as clinker construction. Each plank was laid so that it overlapped the one below it, like shingles on a roof. These overlapping planks were then fastened together with hand-wrought iron rivets, hammered through from the outside and clenched tight over a square washer or rove on the inside. The gaps were caulked with tarred animal hair, making the hull watertight. This method created a hull that was not rigid and brittle, but astonishingly light and flexible. A longship did not fight the waves. It rode them, its hull flexing and twisting with the motion of the water, absorbing shocks that would have shattered a heavier, more rigid vessel. It was, in a very real sense, alive. Its design was a stroke of genius. It was long and slender, with a ratio of length to width of about 7:1, giving it incredible speed. It was also completely symmetrical, the bow and stern being identical mirror images. This meant the ship could reverse direction instantly, without the slow, clumsy process of turning around. A decisive advantage when navigating treacherous, ice-choked fjords, or making a swift retreat from a hostile shore. But its single greatest feature, the key that unlocked the world, was its remarkably shallow draft. A fully loaded warship, a fearsome drakkar bristling with warriors, might draw as little as 1 meter, just over 3 feet, of water. This meant it had no need for deep, fortified harbors. It could land directly on almost any gently shelving beach, allowing its warriors to disembark and charge ashore with shocking speed. Even more critically, it could leave the open ocean behind and navigate far inland, sailing up rivers like the Seine, the Thames, or the Volga, striking at cities and monasteries that believed themselves safe, hundreds of kilometers from the coast. Propulsion was a sophisticated dual system. On the open sea, the crew would raise a single, massive square sail, woven from heavy wool and often dyed in bold red and white stripes. This sail, mounted on a mast that could be over 12 meters tall, around 40 feet, could catch the wind and drive the ship at speeds of up to 15 knots, or nearly 30 kilometers per hour, a blistering pace for the era. But when the wind died, or when speed and maneuverability were needed for battle, the mast was lowered and the ship's true engine came to life: the crew. Along the sides of the ship were the oar ports, small circular holes that could be sealed with wooden plugs. Through these, the men would run their long oars, and the ship would surge forward under the power of their muscles. A typical warship might have 30 pairs of oars, 60 men pulling in perfect, practiced rhythm, transforming the vessel into a swift and silent predator. To be a crewman on such a voyage was to endure an ordeal of exposure and hardship. There were no cabins, no shelters from the elements. The men lived, ate, and slept on the open deck. Their only protection, a blanket or a sleeping bag made of hide. They were constantly cold, lashed by stinging spray, and soaked by rain. Their world a cramped space of rough timbers, coiled ropes, and the constant, heaving motion of the sea. They navigated not by compass, but by a deep, intimate knowledge passed down through generations. They used the sun and the pole, star, the migratory patterns of birds, the color and temperature of the water, and the distant shapes of coastlines. Some sagas speak of a solarstein, a sunstone, perhaps a piece of calcite crystal that could be used to find the sun's position even on a gray, overcast day. A near magical tool for a people venturing into the vast, unmarked wilderness of the North Atlantic. This shared hardship and shared danger forged an unbreakable bond between the men of a crew, a loyalty to each other as strong as the oak beneath their feet. The perfection of this vessel was the catalyst, but the true reasons the Norse people began to pour out of their homelands were complex, a perfect storm of pressures at home and temptations from abroad. The farmsteads, for all their rugged beauty, were finite. The best land, the fertile strips along the fjords, was already occupied. By the late 8th century, a growing population meant that younger sons, who would not inherit the family farm, faced a bleak future of landless poverty. They had to seek their fortune elsewhere, and the Longship provided the means. At the same time, Scandinavia was in political turmoil. Powerful chieftains and petty kings were locked in a constant struggle for dominance. Figures like Harald Fairhair in Norway were beginning to consolidate power, imposing taxes and a unified rule that many fiercely independent landowners and local chiefs found intolerable. For these proud men, sailing away to find new lands to settle was not just an economic choice. It was a political act, a defiant refusal to bend the knee. These pressures pushed them from behind, but the pull from beyond the horizon was irresistible. The Norse were already part of a vast trading network, and through this, they heard stories. They learned of the kingdoms to the south and west. Francia, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, the Celtic monasteries of Ireland. These lands were wealthy, filled with silver and gold. But more importantly, they were politically fragmented and, in many places, utterly unprepared for the kind of warfare the Vikings would unleash. The monasteries, in particular, were seen not as sacred places of God, but as repositories of vast, undefended treasure. For a young man with nothing to lose and a burning desire for the wealth and honor that came with it, the calculus was simple. A single successful raid could transform his life, turning him from a landless farmer into a man of substance and respect. Silver was the ultimate measure of success. Not as coinage, which they rarely used, but as raw bullion, valued by weight. It was hacked into pieces, worn in great rings on the arm, and distributed by a successful chieftain to his warriors, the ultimate proof of his ability to lead and provide. The Longship was the key to this treasure chest. It was the vessel of a new and brutal form of enterprise, where the line between a trader seeking a new market and a raider seeking plunder was often as thin as the edge of an axe. It was this potent combination, a revolutionary technology, demographic pressure, political strife, and the glittering lure of foreign silver that lit the fuse. The age of the Longship had dawned, and the world was about to learn the meaning of the words that would soon be whispered in terrified prayers along every coast. From the fury of the Northmen, "Good Lord, deliver us." The journey began not with a roar, but with the quiet scrape of a keel on wet sand. For a young man named Bjorn, standing waist-deep in the cold green water of the fjord, the moment was a threshold between two worlds. Behind him lay the familiar toil of the farmstead, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, the life he had always known. Ahead lay the Hav, the open ocean, and the promise of a life he had only heard of in the sagas sung by the fire on long winter nights. He was going on a Viking, a word that to him was not an identity, but an action, an expedition. It was a rite of passage, a chance to win the silver and renown that would elevate him from a boy to a man of substance. The Longship, a vessel named Sea Serpent, floated lightly on the water, its dragon-headed prow seeming to taste the salt on the wind. It was crewed by 30 men, a mix of seasoned veterans whose scarred faces and calloused hands told their own stories, and other youths like him, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and ferocious ambition. Their gear was stowed aboard, shields with brightly painted designs hooked over the gunwale, spears and axes lashed to the thwarts, and their personal chests containing dried fish, hard bread, and a few precious tools. But alongside the weapons of war were bundles of fine furs, bear, fox, and marten, as well as walrus ivory and gleaming blocks of amber, the gold of the north. This journey was not simply for plunder, it was for profit, and they were prepared to be merchants as much as they were warriors. With a final collective heave, the Sea Serpent was free. The crew scrambled aboard. The great square sail was hauled up the mast, and as it caught the wind, the ship surged forward, leaving the familiar shores of home to shrink behind them. For days, their world was one of timber, wool, and water. The cramped confines of the ship forced an intense intimacy, the men working, eating, and sleeping side by side. The sea was their constant companion, a creature of shifting moods. One day, it could be a placid, sun-dappled highway. The next, a raging monster of gray, mountainous waves that crashed over the bow, drenching them in water so cold it felt like a physical blow. A frigid 10 degrees Celsius, or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They huddled in their woolen cloaks, gnawing on tough, salty fish, their spirits buoyed only by the shared hardship and the powerful, rhythmic chanting of sea shanties that kept time for the oarsmen when the wind failed. Their first landfall was a bustling trading town at the mouth of a wide river, a place where Frisians, Franks, and Saxons met to exchange goods. Here, the Norsemen were not conquerors, but traders. They anchored the Sea Serpent and rowed a smaller boat ashore, setting up a temporary market on the beach. They carefully unrolled their magnificent furs, their deep, rich textures a stark contrast to the coarse, local woolens. The ivory tusks, some nearly a meter long, almost 3 feet, gleamed in the pale sunlight. Bjorn watched, fascinated, as his chieftain, a shrewd and calculating man named Einar, haggled with a Frankish merchant. There was no common language, only the universal dialect of commerce. Einar would point to a pile of furs, then to the merchant's silver arm ring. The Frank would shake his head, holding up 3 fingers. Einar would laugh, then reluctantly remove one of the smaller pelts. The trade was finalized by a handshake, and the cold, heavy weight of silver being poured into a Norse scale. They traded for things they could not produce at home. Fine, Rhenish wine in wooden casks, bolts of brightly dyed cloth, and glass beads that shimmered with a beauty unknown in their northern lands. For 2 days, they were peaceful merchants. But all the while, they were also gathering information, their eyes and ears open, listening to the gossip of the port, learning of the region's politics and the location of its wealth. It was on the 3rd day that the news came. A drunken sailor spoke of a rich monastery, a god house, just a day's sail up the coast, situated on a small, tide-locked island. He described it as a place of immense wealth, filled with gold and silver, and inhabited only by strangely robed men who prayed all day and carried no weapons. That evening, aboard the Sea Serpent, Einar held a council. The mood had changed. The casual air of the marketplace was gone, replaced by a tense, hungry anticipation. There would be no more haggling. The time for trade was over. The time for raiding had come. They set out at dawn. The ship felt different now, its purpose sharpened to a razor's edge. The men were quiet, their faces grim as they checked the bindings on their axe heads and the sharpness of their spear points. They were not a mindless horde. They were professional predators, and this was the hunt. As they approached the island, they lowered the sail and took to the oars, the ship gliding silently through the water. Bjorn's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden stillness. He gripped his shield, its leather strap slick with the sweat from his palm, and his axe, its handle worn smooth by his father's hand before him. They rounded a headland, and there it was, a collection of stone buildings, a single tall tower pointing to the sky, all seemingly asleep in the morning mist. They had achieved perfect surprise. The keel of the Longship ground onto the sand of a secluded beach with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud. Einar let out a single, guttural roar, and the spell of silence was broken. The Norsemen poured over the side of the ship, a wave of 30 men charging across the dunes. They were not a disciplined army in neat ranks, but a terrifying, fluid mass of individual warriors. They raised their shields and roared, a primal, chilling cry designed to shatter the nerve of any defender. It worked. The monks, who had just emerged for their morning prayers, froze in utter disbelief and terror. To them, these men who had appeared from nowhere, with their long hair, their beards braided, and their eyes wild with battle lust, were not men at all. They were demons sent from hell. The next few minutes were a blur of chaotic, brutal violence. Bjorn ran alongside his comrades, his legs pumping, the world narrowed to the man in front of him. There was no strategy, no complex maneuvering, only the savage imperative to close with the enemy and overwhelm them. He saw one of the unarmed monks turn to flee, and acting on pure instinct, he lunged. The bearded head of his axe, a wicked blade nearly 30 centimeters, a full foot long, swung in a vicious arc. The heavy iron bit deep into the man's back, and he fell without a sound. Bjorn felt a sickening jolt run up his arm, but there was no time for shock or remorse. The raid was a whirlwind of motion. The Norsemen smashed down the heavy wooden doors of the chapel. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet smell of incense, and the room glittered with treasure. They ignored the wooden crucifixes and statues, which held no value for them, and went straight for the precious metals. They ripped golden crosses from the altar, tore the jewel-encrusted covers from holy books, and stuffed silver chalices and plates into leather sacks. For the Vikings, this was not sacrilege. It was work. This was the silver they had come for. The violence was swift, targeted, and purposeful. They killed those who resisted and any who might be able to raise an alarm. The others, the younger, stronger monks and local servants, were rounded up, their hands bound with rope. They were now thralls, the most valuable form of plunder after silver, destined to be sold in the slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby, or to spend the rest of their lives toiling on a Norwegian farmstead. Within an hour, it was over. The Norsemen retreated back to the beach, leaving behind a scene of carnage and smoldering buildings. They were gone as quickly as they had arrived, the sea serpent pulling away from the shore, its deck now laden with treasure and weeping captives. Looking back, Bjorn saw a pillar of black smoke rising into the clear blue sky, the only sign that they had ever been there. The journey home was triumphant. They divided the spoils, Einar using a hacksaw to cut the sacred plates and chalices into smaller, weighted pieces of hack silver. He distributed the wealth, each man receiving a share based on his experience and role in the raid. Bjorn held a piece of a silver platter in his hand, its surface still bearing the faint etching of a saint. It felt impossibly heavy, This single piece of metal was worth more than his family could earn in a year of farming. He had left home a boy with a hand-me-down axe. He would return a man of property, his reputation forged in the fire and blood of his first raid, his place in the world secured not by the sweat of his brow, but by the fury of the Northmen, the same violent, restless energy that propelled the dragon-headed Longship onto a beach of plunder also pushed it out into the vast, featureless expanse of the open ocean. The spirit of the Viking was not just about raiding. It was about venturing, about pushing against the edges of the known world to see what lay beyond. The sea, for them, was not a barrier, but a road, and the Norse people became its greatest explorers, pioneers who sailed their open ships not just in search of silver, but in search of land itself. This was the other side of their fury, the relentless, patient courage of the farmer and the settler, a drive to find a place where a family could build a new life, free from the pressures of overpopulation and the heavy hand of consolidating kings. Their gaze turned west, into the teeth of the wind and the unknown terrors of the North Atlantic. The first step was a tentative one, a journey of nearly 500 kilometers, about 300 miles, from the coast of Norway into the empty sea. Here, their ships found the Faroe Islands, a scattering of treeless, wind-swept rocks shrouded in mist. They were uninhabited, a blank slate, their steep green slopes perfect for grazing the hardy sheep the Norse brought with them. It was a modest beginning, a foothold in the great ocean, but it was proof that land, new land, lay waiting for those with the courage to seek it. It was from these new outposts and from Norway itself that the next, far greater leap was made. It was a voyage into myth, a journey driven by accident and desperation. A Norse navigator named Nadod, blown off course on his way to the Faroes, was the first to sight a vast, unknown coastline. He found a land of fjords and mountains, but it was snowing, so he named it Snaland, the land of snow. Others followed, charting its coasts and marveling at its strangeness. It was a place of shocking contrasts, a land of smoking earth and frozen rivers, where colossal glaciers, some hundreds of meters or many hundreds of feet, thick, ground their way down valleys that steamed with geothermal heat. It was a land of fur and ice, and they called it Iceland. What made Iceland truly extraordinary was that it was utterly empty of people. This was a new world, a vast island where a man could claim as much land as he could mark out. This promise of freedom and ownership ignited a mass migration, especially from Norway. where King Harold Fairhair was ruthlessly unifying the country, imposing taxes and his authority on the fiercely independent local chieftains and free farmers. For a Norseman, to pay taxes to an overlord was a profound humiliation, a step down from the status of a free carl. And so they packed their families, their livestock, and their disassembled longhouses onto the broader, sturdier cargo ships known as nars and sailed west. The process of claiming land, the landnam, was a ritual. A settler would sail along the coast until he found a promising spot. He would then take the high seat pillars from his old longhouse, great carved timbers that represented the soul of his family and its connection to the gods, and cast them into the sea. Wherever the waves washed them ashore, that is where he would build his new farm, trusting the gods and the currents to choose his destiny. Within 60 years, every habitable piece of land along the coast and in the river valleys of Iceland was settled. They had not just found a new home. They had created a new nation from scratch, a republic of free farmers without a king. Here, they established their greatest social innovation, the Althing, a national assembly held each summer where all the free people gathered to make laws and settle disputes, creating the world's oldest surviving parliament in a stark and treeless valley. But even the vastness of Iceland was not enough for some. The horizon still called. The next chapter of their westward expansion was driven by a man whose life embodied the violent contradictions of his age, Eric the Red, a man whose temper was as fiery as his hair. Eric was forced to flee Norway after his father was exiled for manslaughter. He settled in Iceland, but his own violent nature soon caught up with him, and after killing several men in a feud, he was declared an outlaw by the Althing, sentenced to 3 years of exile. With Norway behind him and Iceland closed to him, there was only one direction to go: further west. He had heard sailors' tales of another land spotted in the distance on a voyage that had been blown off course. Eric gathered a crew and a ship and sailed into the unknown. What he found was a land even more forbidding than Iceland, a colossal island almost entirely buried under a permanent, monolithic ice cap. But along its southern and western coasts, he found deep fjords that, warmed by an eddy of the Gulf Stream, were green and surprisingly fertile during the brief summer. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring this new land, and when his sentence was up, he sailed back to Iceland with a plan. He knew that survival in this new place would depend on attracting more settlers, and so he gave it a name that was a masterpiece of propaganda. He called it Greenland. The name worked. Lured by the promise of verdant pastures, hundreds of families followed Eric back across the treacherous, ice-choked waters. They established two main settlements, the eastern and western settlements, where they built their longhouses and tried to replicate the farming life they had known. But Greenland was a world at the absolute edge of existence. The winters were longer and colder than in Iceland, with temperatures that could hold at -30 degrees Celsius, or 22 below zero Fahrenheit, for weeks on end. They could grow grass for their livestock, but grain crops were almost impossible. Their survival depended on a constant, arduous hunt for the resources of the sea and the ice. They hunted seals for meat and hides, and ventured far to the north, on dangerous, multi-week expeditions to the Disco Bay hunting grounds for their most precious commodity, walrus ivory. The tusks, ropes, and tough hides of the walrus were the currency that connected their fragile colony to Europe. The goods they traded for the iron, tools, and timber they could not produce themselves. For nearly 500 years, this small, tenacious community of Norse farmers clung to life at the edge of the world, their existence a testament to their incredible resilience. It was from this remote outpost in Greenland that the final, most astounding chapter of their exploration was written. Eric the Red's own son, Leif, a man who inherited his father's ambition, but not his violent temper, heard a story from a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni, caught in a fog on his way to Greenland, had been blown far to the southwest and had sighted 3 new lands, but had not gone ashore. Leif, intrigued, bought Bjarni's ship and, around the year 1000, set out to retrace the route. He and his crew of 35 men first came to a barren land of flat, gray stones and glaciers, which he named Helluland, the land of flat stones, what we know today as Baffin Island. Sailing south, they came to a second land, one that was flat and covered in dense forest. He called it Markland, the land of forests, which was likely the coast of Labrador. Continuing south, they finally found what they were looking for. They sailed into a bay, pulled their ship up a river, and came to a lake. The land around them was a paradise beyond their wildest dreams. The rivers were so thick with salmon, fish larger than any they had ever seen, that it seemed you could walk across their backs. The forests were filled with magnificent timber, a resource of unimaginable value to the Greenlanders. And, most wondrous of all, growing wild in the woods were vines, laden with grapes. In their astonishment, Leif named this place Vinland, the land of wine. They built a small settlement of turf-walled longhouses, Leif's Buder, and spent a winter there, basking in a climate so mild that the cattle could graze outdoors year-round. They had done it. They had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and had reached a new continent, a new world, nearly 500 years before Columbus. But they were not alone. One day, they encountered the native inhabitants, people they called Skraelingar. The first meeting was tense but peaceful, a silent encounter of mutual astonishment, followed by a brief trade. The Norse offered milk and red cloth for the natives' fine furs. But the relationship was fragile, built on a foundation of profound misunderstanding. The sagas tell of a conflict that erupted when one of the Skraelingar tried to steal a weapon, or when the Norse chieftain's bull broke loose and terrified the natives. Whatever the spark, the encounter descended into violence. The Norse had the terrifying advantage of iron weapons, their axes and swords slicing through the natives' stone and bone tools. But the Skraelingar had the overwhelming advantage of numbers and an intimate knowledge of the land. After a fierce skirmish, the Norse realized their position was untenable. They were a tiny handful of people, thousands of kilometers, thousands of miles from any hope of reinforcement. They could win a single battle, but they could never win the war against an entire continent of hostile inhabitants. And so, after only a few years, they made the pragmatic decision to leave. They packed their longship with timber, furs, and dried grapes, and sailed back to the familiar hardships of Greenland. Vinland became a memory, a story told and retold in the smoky longhouses, a legendary shore at the ultimate edge of their world, a final testament to the Viking spirit of exploration that had carried them beyond the horizon itself. The age of the Viking, like the long summer day of the north, could not last forever. An era that had exploded across the world on the wave of the Longship began to recede, not in a single cataclysmic event, but through a slow and profound transformation that changed the very heart of the Norse people. The fury that had once terrified the world did not vanish. It was tamed, assimilated, and absorbed into the new Europe that the Vikings themselves had helped to create. The forces that ended their age were as complex as those that had begun it. From the south, a new faith crept northward, a religion of a single, powerful God, whose message was carried not by the axe, but by the patient words of monks and the political ambitions of kings. Christianity offered a different worldview, one with a heaven and a hell, with powerful saints and a unifying structure that appealed to the Scandinavian rulers who sought to consolidate their lands into unified kingdoms. The cross began to appear on necklaces alongside the hammer of Thor. And slowly, over generations, the old gods retreated into the realm of folklore. With this new faith came a new way of being. The warrior's death that promised a seat in Valhalla was replaced by a life of piety that promised salvation. At the same time, the world the Vikings had once raided so freely had learned its lesson. In England and Francia, castles and fortified towns sprang up, and professional armies were organized. The old tactics of speed and surprise were no longer so effective against a prepared and determined defense. The era of easy plunder was over. The Viking Age effectively ended not with a final, glorious raid, but with the quiet sound of a church bell ringing where a sacrificial grove once stood. Yet, to say the age ended is to miss the point. The Vikings were not vanquished. They became a part of the world they had once sought to conquer. Their descendants ruled in Normandy, in England, and in the heart of Russia. They settled and forever changed the genetic and cultural landscape of the lands they had touched. Their legacy is not found in the ruins of monasteries, but is etched into the very fabric of our modern world, often in ways we no longer recognize. Their echo is in our language. When you look up at the sky, speak to your husband, break an egg, or call a law, you are speaking with a Norse tongue. Their mark is on our maps, in the names of towns and villages across Britain and Ireland, ending in by, Thorpe, or Thwaite. Their spirit of a self-governing people, of free farmers gathering in the open air to argue their own laws at the Thing, resonates in our own traditions of public assembly and trial by a jury of one's peers. And their journey is written in the DNA of millions, a silent, biological testament to their voyages from the Caspian Sea to the coast of North America. The true story of what it was like to be a Viking, therefore, is not a simple tale of a bloodthirsty warrior. It is the story of a farmer, struggling against a harsh climate to feed his family. It is the story of a lawmaker standing under an open sky to forge a society of order and honor. It is the story of a craftsman whose hands could turn wood and iron into a vessel of breathtaking speed and beauty. It is the story of an explorer who, guided by the sun and the stars, sailed into the unknown and touched a new world. And yes, it is the story of a warrior whose fury was the cutting edge of an era of explosive and violent change. The horned helmet was a fiction, but the real people of the Viking Age were far more enduring. Their age has passed, but their echo remains, a permanent and indelible part of the story of the world.